we will get started just for so we're on time. I just would like to first thank you all for coming and joining our first Bright Spark session. I'd like to commence our session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which our campus libraries are located, the Jaja Wurrung, the Lachi Lachi, Barkindji, Doodaroa, Waywuru, Yorta Yorta, Bangarang peoples, and particularly the Wurundjeri people of the lands in which I live and work. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and to all other Aboriginal people who may be present today. I'd also like to introduce and thank our guest speaker, Jacinta. So thank you for coming and joining us today, Jacinta.
No worries.
Jacinta's going to take us through some of her insights into the research world, challenges, successes, share a bit of her interest into impacts of urbanisation on bird communities, and just share a little bit of her story and her journey. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jacinta, so you can get going, and I'll also stop sharing my screen.
Cool. So thank you for that introduction, Katie, and thank you for inviting me to come along and speak this afternoon. As Katie mentioned, my name is Jacinta, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Ecology, Environment and Evolution. I'm based at the Bundoora campus at Trobe University. So this afternoon, I'm hoping to give you a bit of an overview into my journey in conservation research to date. I'm going to talk a bit about how I came to study in this area and briefly what my PhD is about. Hopefully, I'll also give you a bit of an insight into what it's actually like to be a postdoctoral researcher here at La Trobe. So if you have any questions at all during my talk, please feel free to just type them in the chat and I can address them at the end. So my journey in conservation science actually started off on a beach in northeastern Brazil. When I finished high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I had a range of quite different interests. I was really into animals and the environment, but then I was also quite passionate about graphic design and photography. And I couldn't decide which avenue I wanted to take or how I could potentially combine these quite different passions. So as an 18-year-old does, I put those hard decisions on hold and I took a gap year. And during that year off, I spent 6 months living and volunteering in Brazil. And I worked with an organization called Tartaruga Marina, and they monitored, rehabilitated, and protected endangered sea turtles. If you want to ask how I came to do all this, please feel free to ask me at the end. So my job as a volunteer with this organization was to patrol 2 local beaches at night, and we would be looking for nesting female hawksbill sea turtles. So they look like this beautiful turtle up in the top left corner. And these female turtles would drag themselves up out of the ocean onto the sand so that they could dig a nest and lay their eggs. And when we came across a female turtle like this one on the beach, we would leave her be, let her do her thing. And once she had finished laying her eggs and she was heading back to the ocean to leave, we would then check to see if she was tagged, because many of these turtles had been studied over several years. And we would also weigh her to be monitoring her health and her growth if she was still growing. And we'd mark the location of her nest. And we'd then come back to that same spot around 60 days later in the hopes of seeing something like this. So seeing her hatchlings coming out of the nest and making their way down towards the ocean. As you can imagine, this was an incredible experience for me, especially as an 18-year-old who'd never traveled overseas before. It gave me a really unique opportunity to work closely with researchers and PhD students who were local people from Brazil. But most importantly, it made me realize just how passionate I was about wildlife conservation. I suddenly felt like this was a really obvious career path for me, and I returned to Australia feeling much more enthusiastic and motivated for my future. So when I got home, I applied for and I was accepted to study a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife and Conservation Biology here at La Trobe. And I absolutely loved my undergraduate degree. I was lucky enough to visit some amazing places on field trips, including the Mallee region in northwestern Victoria, Wilson's Promontory National Park, and also Heron Island, which is a tropical island at the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Gladstone. So at the end of my 3 years, I was keen to continue studying. I was loving what I was doing. And I was actually offered an opportunity to undertake an honours project in zoology. And in honours, there's a set number of projects that are on offer, which are generally quite fixed. There will be a supervisor who is looking after you. And one of those fixed projects in the year that I was coming through was focusing on a threatened species that was living on the outskirts of Melbourne. So to me, this sounded perfect. So I applied and I went for it. So I then spent the next 9 months studying this guy. This is a swamp skink. And swamp skinks are a threatened species here in Victoria. They live in wet coastal environments, often around the Morning Peninsula and Western Port Bay. Now, they're a very shy species, so we don't often see them out in the open that much, which means it's really difficult to know if they actually occur at a particular location or not. So the aim of my honours project was to improve the way that we survey for this species. The idea was that if we had a better method of surveying them, then we were going to have more success in actually finding them out in the wild, and therefore a greater chance of protecting the species moving forward. So I spent a lot of time out in these kind of wet, very grassy environments, and I was setting up special motion sensing cameras. So that's what I'm doing in this photo in the red t-shirt. I also put out a series of roof tiles and some small box traps. And I was comparing these 3 options to try and determine what was the best way of detecting a swamp skink. And after many months of hard work, I was able to conclude that the cameras were a really good option. So this is a photo in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see a swamp skink has been captured there. And whilst the cameras were obviously more expensive than some of the other options, and they were a little bit of a pain to set up, they were much more effective in the long term. So that was quite a positive outcome for this species. And at the end of my honours, I really wanted to find a job working in conservation. But I soon realised that these are pretty hard to come by. I ended up applying for a bit of a different role and didn't expect to get it at all, but to my great surprise, I actually got the job and I started working as a zookeeper with Zoos Victoria. I worked across a number of different zoos, not just with Zoos Victoria, but also at Ballarat. And I had the opportunity to work with a range of Australian native species, including quokkas, who are absolutely beautiful, arboreal mammals like this sugar glider, and a range of different birds as well, like this red-tailed black cockatoo. I also had a short contract working on Trail of the Elephants at Melbourne Zoo, which was absolutely incredible, to say the least. I learnt a lot in a very short space of time. However, after a year or so of moving between different contracts and different zoos, things were starting to feel a little bit repetitive for me. Whilst working with these animals was amazing, I literally did exactly the same thing every day at exactly the same time. I felt like I wasn't really being challenged in my day-to-day job, and importantly, I didn't think I was making an impact in conservation science. I knew that in conservation, evidence was power. Nothing was ever going to change unless you had the hard scientific proof to back it up. So I figured that research was the best way that I could contribute to this field. So when my last zookeeping contract ended, I made the choice to walk away and I returned to the world of research. So I came back to La Trobe, partly because I had loved it here, but also I wanted to approach a particular academic who had recently moved to La Trobe Uni from Deakin in order to discuss a potential research idea. One of the key things that I had become really interested in was the impact of urban development on wildlife. I had seen examples of this during my honours year when I was studying swamp skinks. There were populations of skinks that had lost their habitat because of new housing developments that were popping up around the Mornington Peninsula. And the same thing had actually been happening way back in Brazil when I was working with sea turtles. There were new resorts and tourism infrastructure that were being built right on the beach. And this was right in close proximity to where the turtles were nesting. So chances are it was having an impact on them as well. I really wanted to contribute to this field, and luckily, this new academic at La Trobe agreed to take me on as a PhD student with one condition. I had to study birds. And I'd never worked on birds before. I'd looked after them in the zoo for a short period of time, but I hadn't studied them scientifically before. So I knew I had a lot to learn in this field, but I was keen to give it a go. So I embarked on my PhD. To introduce my project further, I'm going to play you guys a short video. So this is an animation that I created a couple of years ago as part of a competition called Visualise Your Thesis. You're more than welcome to ask me questions about this as well at the end, but I hope you enjoy it.
Cities are important places for people. They also provide habitat for plants and animals, including some threatened species. Sadly, many species that share our cities are under threat due to expanding urban development. How can we conserve these urban dwellers and work towards sustainable, wildlife-friendly cities? This is where my PhD comes in. I study the impacts of urbanisation on bird communities. I aim to identify actions we can take to make our cities more livable for birds. I surveyed for birds in 30 suburbs across Melbourne. My results show that suburbs with high-density housing have fewer bird species. However, areas with more tree cover have greater bird diversity. Retaining trees may help to conserve birds in our cities, creating a greener future for people and wildlife. Cities.
So in case you missed it in that very short video, the overall aim of my PhD is to determine the relative influence of human infrastructure, such as housing, and available habitat, such as trees, on the diversity and composition of bird communities throughout Melbourne. For the purpose of today's presentation, because we're a little bit limited on time, I'm just going to be talking about bird diversity, or the number of bird species that are living within a particular suburb. So to investigate this topic, I selected a series of suburbs that were positioned along two spatial gradients, the first of which was a gradient of housing cover. If you imagine the city of Melbourne occurring on a long straight line, it starts in the CBD, moves out through the suburbs, and then out to rural areas where there's less housing, less development. For my study, I chose to focus on the middle of that gradient, so I was avoiding the really high density city and the rural areas. My chosen landscapes were grouped into three categories. So I had urban or high density, which had over 1,000 houses, suburban or medium density, which had 400 to 800 houses, and peri-urban or low density with 100 to 200 houses. In addition to these three housing categories, I also surveyed along a continuous gradient of canopy tree cover. So I selected a total of 30 study landscapes to fulfill these requirements, which was quite a tricky process. And half of these, 15, included a waterway, like a creek or a river, and 15 did not. So importantly here, I wasn't trying to target areas where I thought I'd get a really high or a really low diversity of birds. I was simply trying to select areas that I felt were representative of Greater Melbourne. So this map shows the location of all of my 30 study landscapes, which were spaced a minimum of 1 kilometre apart throughout the northern and eastern suburbs. So I chose to survey in this particular part of Melbourne because it contains the highest extent of canopy tree cover for the whole of the city. So to orientate yourself on this map, the two high density areas close to the city are Hawthorn and Kooyong. They then extend as far north as Hurstbridge and as far east as Mount Evelyn. As you will have seen, each of my study landscapes was circular, and they covered a total area of 100 hectares or 1 square kilometre. Within each landscape, I established 10 survey sites, which were spaced a minimum of 200 metres apart. And then at each site, I conducted a 10-minute point count to record all the bird species seen and heard within a 40-metre radius. So a point count just means that I'm standing in one place and I'm timing it with a stopwatch for 10 minutes to see what birds come past. Overall, I conducted 5 survey rounds over a period of 16 months from September 2018 to December 2019. Now I'll move on to some brief results. So in total, I conducted 1,500 bird surveys where I recorded 76 species, including 71 native species and 5 exotic species. The most commonly recorded birds included the noisy myna, Australian magpie, common or Indian myna, spotted turtle dove, red wattlebird, little raven, rainbow lorikeets, and the grey butcherbird. All 8 of these species were recorded in over 20% of my surveys at more than 180 sites, and they were present in all 30 landscapes. So they're pretty widespread across my study region. Now we'll have a quick look at the influence of housing cover on bird diversity. So this graph shows the extent of the landscape covered by housing on the x-axis